Okay, we're at 1 minute past now, so I'm going to suggest that we make a start. So welcome everybody to our thought leadership today, which is about delivering digital transformation, facing 5 dilemmas for a sustainable future. So I'm really pleased to welcome Professor Alan Brown. He's Professor in Digital Economy at the University of Exeter. His research interests are about taking an agile approach to business transformation, and in particular, the relationship between technology innovation and business transformation. Alan's got a background in computer science. He's got a PhD in computer science, and he has extensive experience working in industry in the UK and around the world, as well as in academia. And he's currently the director of the DigitLab project, which we're going to hear a bit more about today. So Alan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you everybody for joining today. I hope it's a pleasant day wherever you are in the world. I'm going to share a few slides and talk about this idea of delivering digital transformation and how we face a set of dilemmas that I think are pretty critical for us right now to particularly think about in terms of building a more sustainable future. And I'm going to try to define this idea of sustainability in a very broad sense. So hopefully we'll get a little chance over the next 20 or 30 minutes to talk through that, and there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. In the meantime, if you've got some interactions and you want to send some interactions on the chat, please do so, and we'll try and pick those up as we go along. So let's get going if we can. So as Carol suggested, what we're going to talk about is about digital transformation, which is a very broad term. But I'd like to place it in the context of the particular research program that I'm directing now with a team that includes the University of Exeter Business School, but also several other universities and partners, including Oxford Brookes, the University of East Anglia, Royal Holloway, and the support of a number of research agencies, the Engineering Physical Sciences Research Agency, the Digital Economy theme, and the Manufacturing the Future theme. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to place it in the context of what's happening, particularly for large established organizations, what we call LEOs. And we're interested in this because of scale, the largeness of these organizations, their establishedness, so heritage, they've got products in the marketplace, they've got skills and investment, they've got infrastructure and assets, but also the fact that they're organizations, which means they have structures, which means they have governance and regulations, which means they have often a quite complex culture built over many years with many contributors. So we're very interested in what happens with change in those sorts of environments. So let's kick off and let's try and dive into this and think a little bit about this idea of digital transformation, digital innovation, and what happens in large-scale organizations. So let's start with perhaps something a little trite, a little obvious. What is this? Well, of course, it's a car, it's a vehicle, it's some sort of automobile. But what's interesting, of course, is we're starting to see physical devices, whether it's that car, whether it's this pen, whether it's any sort of device that you see in your office, on your table around you right now. We're starting to see these as an opportunity to build digital wrappers around some sort of physical artifact. A digital wrapper around a physical artifact. What does that mean? Well, what it means is we begin to see these physical artifacts in new ways. We see them as containers for, or elements around which we can build a set of digital information that's streamed about the state of this artifact, where it is, whether it's being used in a particular way, what angle it's at, what its current refresh rate is, if it's filled with some sort of fuel in this case, or if it was ink in a pen or whatever it was. We're beginning to see also some things about what surrounds it. What is it interacting with? What's going on on the road, in the air around it, on the street? What's the ambient temperature? What's the lighting? We can also see something about the history of this vehicle. Is it are the brakes well used? When were they maintained? If it was a pen, maybe we know where it's been written, who's been writing with it. Whatever this artifact is, we can begin to stream information in relative real time about this artifact and its status, about the context in which it's operating. Perhaps we can also see it in relationship to every other artifact that is like this, every other car on the road, every other car that's gone down this piece of road. the state of this road over some period of time and its relationship to this car. As soon as we start to see that, we start to begin to view what this vehicle is in a different way than we did before. We see it in a real-time context as a provider of information, as a vehicle, as a vessel for us beginning to see how this artifact interacts with us, with the world around us, with everything about what's going on. Why is that interesting and important? It's because we start to move into a different way of thinking. We start to think about this in a way that changes our perception of the world. First of all, in terms of how we produced it. What is it? How do we produce it? What's in it? So for vehicles like cars, we're not so interested in bending metal. We're interested in it as a container for software and other hardware devices. We're interested in it in terms of an upgradable infrastructure that we can amend and apply to different contexts. So the way we build it's different. And if you think about the assembly processes for these sorts of artifacts, they're very different than they were some time ago. So those industries have shifted substantially. But more than that, they change the way in which we view that artifact in relationship to the industries that they spawn or are part of or form part of a broad ecosystem. In terms of the car industry, as you know, we've seen a massive reshaping of the car industry over the last 20, 30 years. And I think we're only at the beginning of that change. How that industry sees itself, how it categorizes the different players in that industry, how they interact, their relationship, and in particular, how they work together to create value is quite different today than it was 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago when these industries were started and as they began to mature. So we see these industries very differently because of the change to the artifacts. But even further than that, we actually view the idea of mobility very differently. What we're trying to do when we use such a vehicle, when it's appropriate, who owns it, how it's used, how it's shared, how we think about the relationship of that artifact in context of a lot of things that we do and say. So we see the idea of mobility now perhaps quite differently than we did a few years ago. And therefore the idea of why would I own a car? How would I share the car? How many do I need? And in fact, do we see this vehicle as something that is precious to me or something that I want to see very differently? Let's take an example with a vehicle like this. If we're trying to think about profitability, if I'm a car manufacturer, then my profitability comes from making more cars, selling more cars, and driving up the margin for the cost of production versus the cost of sale. If I think from this different idea of mobility, what I might want to do is drive up the utility, the utilization of the cars that I produce. The value is in the use of the vehicle, shared use, opportunities to repair it, to manage it in new ways. If I think from that point of view, the idea of profitability and sustainability is I want to see if I can create more value, more profit, more availability, more usage by having fewer vehicles on the road, not more, and therefore being able to deal with them and treat them very differently. That is a quite substantial change in perception. How do I make more money, create a more sustainable environment, creating fewer artifacts? That's a revolutionary thought. And I think we can begin to do that because we're starting to think from a digital perspective, not from an analog perspective. So let's develop that idea a little bit more, perhaps. When we're starting to think about digital transformation, we're going through a series of changes in how we think. I think we started thinking about digital very much as a sort of technology upgrade. It was a very internal focus. Can we become more efficient? Can we use more digital capabilities, move from maybe paper-based artifacts to online PDFs, to editable PDFs, to other sorts of documents and ways of collecting information? We tried to digitize what was going on by thinking about digital as a technology upgrade. Then we started to think a little bit more perhaps about channels to market. We're thinking about digital as a way to connect, a way to interact with people in some sort of transactional relationship, interactional relationship. So we were very concerned about, can we use digital channels in order to maybe think about how we get to somebody on a mobile phone, which they carry about with them all the time, or connect through some other ambient device that's around them, or they're wearing, or is somewhere in the buildings that they're in. So the third idea then was, as we start to do that, maybe we're beginning to think about what business is, what our interactions are, where the value is created, how value is captured and shared. We begin to think about that in new ways. And in particular, we started to think more about subscription-based models. I don't sell you this pen. I sell you access to this pen. I sell you the use of this pen. And perhaps I even sell you the outcome of this pen. I may give you this pen if we can work on what the outcome is, and we share some kind of value of the outcome. So we started to see new business models. And then we started to say, well, it's the data insights that become interesting. How and when things are used, whether you use them differently when you're with different people or at different times of the day, whether the interactions become interesting. And in fact, that information became very valuable. Learning about behavior, learning about changes of behavior, learning about how things interact and why, and then using that to drive perhaps other forms of value elsewhere. And then finally, of course, a lot of what we're seeing perhaps right now in the current environment is digital and digital technologies actually as a form of social transformation. Think about who has power and who doesn't when we're sharing information. You know, the classic idea of a company or a government knows what's going on and controls what's going on and controls the information flow has perhaps been upended by, actually they're trying to work out what individuals are saying and sharing about their services, about their products, about the way in which they view that company. Things like sentiment analysis, when you're looking at social interactions, is a really important way in which organizations and governments are beginning to understand what's going on and react to what's going on. Sometimes they're trying to control those, sometimes they're trying to tap in and learn from those things. So we see a sort of, if you want to call it that, a kind of power redistribution. So digital transformation is quite a complex and quite a multifaceted set of ideas. So as we think about that, we now see ourselves in a very different world. We look at the future, we look at where we are today and the steps going forward from our digital perspective, perhaps in a quite different way than we did in the past. We see not just these new technologies might replace human effort, but they actually help us to reconceive the world, rethink what we want to do, how we want to do it, who we want to do it with, and what we value. They're fairly substantial moves, aren't they? They're quite substantial different ways of thinking about who we are in this world and what we want companies to be, organizations to be, institutions to be as we evolve. So maybe we should sort of pick that apart a bit. And in thinking about that, how do we pick that apart? How do we drive a little deeper and unpack this? I've been in many conversations, I'm sure you have, about these sorts of ideas. And I've started to see these 5 themes begin to appear. And I'd just like to touch on these very quickly, and then we can have a little conversation perhaps around some of these. So here are the 5 things that I found kind of compelling and interesting. And I think of them as dilemmas, dilemmas that an organization faces as it begins to think about its future. The first is about productivity. We're beginning to think differently about who we are, what we are, how we interact, how we view what we bring to an organization, how we look at ourselves in relationship to the world in quite different ways. Some of those are, in a way, kind of quite straightforward. In our workplace, how would we measure our effectiveness? Of course, we could have said in the past, it's the number of things we do over a unit time. You know, how much stuff are we doing today? How much did we did yesterday? Are we doing more? Are we learning more? But I think productivity has become a much more complex process of thinking about the contribution we make, the outcomes we produce, the value we create. And that's a really difficult concept to measure. So let's have a think a little bit about those measurements. Let's just take one little piece of this problem, just for this conversation. We think quite differently between digitizing and digitally transforming. Digitizing says, how can we take things we do today and add automation so that we can go faster, become more efficient, faster, cheaper, better. The classic way we measure things. We're not changing the value proposition of what we do. What we're doing is rethinking from an automation point of view, how we do things from a speed, from an agility, from a flexibility point of view. And a lot of the traditional things we do, particularly the back office processing that we've automated, we can think in this way. Our way of measuring, our way of thinking about productivity perhaps hasn't changed too much, but the scale that we think about this and the effect of automation is very important to us. That's quite different, I think, from when we start to redesign what we do because of our ability to use digital technologies. If we take these sorts of things like blockchain and smart contracts and some of those innovations, for example, just as one illustration, we start to say, well, maybe we completely rethink things like transactions and insurance and the way we interact. If we're using very automated, very smart kinds of ways of thinking about that, an insurance payment, for example, if we were digitizing insurance, we go from paper-based insurance to the fact that we can take photographs of the car that we crashed or the artifacts that we've had stolen or whatever the insurance scheme is. And maybe we can then automate some of the adjustment process. If we rethink this from a smart contract blockchain point of view, perhaps what we do is we anticipate what's going on. We automate the payments. There is no interaction and photographs needed because we've already logged this in a secure, non-overwriting kind of immutable store. Perhaps even through adjustments like smart contracts and IoT, we can predict what's going to happen and even begin to ensure that some things don't occur. We're actually moving from insurance to assurance. That's a completely different model for life insurance, for business continuity as insurance, for trying to think about all aspects of what we do in that kind of domain. And if it's true in insurance, it's also true in education, in automation, in other forms of work processes. So that idea of digitization, digital transformation completely changes our perception of what we do and productivity and who we do it with and how we measure the success of what we do. So that's one example, and I think this raises an important dilemma to organizations. Do we optimize for today by digitizing, or do we transform for tomorrow, which might mean a completely different way of measuring what we do? And that adjustment is very hard for organizations right now. That leads us to this idea of value. What is the value? Where is the value? What do people value? How do we think about value in a digital world? And how do we think about sustained value? Now, of course, one of the big movements in this area is to think about outcome, not measuring outputs. How many of something are we producing? But starting to think about the outcome. Does it make a difference to those we're trying to affect? What changes does it make? What effects does it have? And how would we maximize those effects to produce some value to us, to them, to those around us? And we see many examples of that. The examples of what organizations like Apple and Amazon and Google do, which is about trying to maximize the outcomes for the people they're serving. And this leads us to those ideas of things like, for example, digital twins. A lot of the idea of digitizing and having digital models, simulations that have feedback from the real world, allows us to think about what's going on so that we can look at the outcomes for all stakeholders. And we maximize what we're trying to do to achieve for those stakeholders. And we do this in a very interactive way. We're constantly thinking, where's the value? What's the outcome? How do we think about those outcomes? And those outcome delivered strategies are really important because they change how we interact with people, how we build partnerships, what those partnerships mean to us, what alignment means for incentives, who's incented to do what when. For example, if I sell you something, I sell you this pen. We're focused on the exchange. We optimize for the sale that happens of you get the pen, I get the money. If we start to think about the outcome, I may give you this pen so that we optimize your use of the pen, and then that use becomes something interesting that we might want to monetize in some way. That might change the whole perception of how many of these we produce, why we produce them, who produces them, whether they get refilled, how we repair them. The whole industry around the finding, repairing, the distribution of these might be very different. Of course, that's what's happening in car sharing. That's what's happening in sharing of many assets. So we start to see again an interesting dilemma. Do we start to think about value and outcomes from the classic point of view, or do we think about value in a new way from the outcomes we're trying to achieve and organize around those outcomes and create a different sort of sustainable company, sustainable organization, and its impacts for a sustainable society? That brings a whole ethical dilemma. So the third of my dilemmas is, as we start to do that, we're gathering more data, we're interacting in different ways, we're building different forms of relationship. That whole opens up a whole bunch of ethical challenges for us. And in particular, as we start to collect that data and we start to balance our outcomes versus our outputs in different ways, we're starting to go back to these ideas of triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. How do we think about that relationship between people, planet, profit? We have to build sustainable companies, companies that exist and employ people and give people a living, give them a wage that helps them to survive in a very difficult environment right now, but not at the expense of what we're doing to the planet or the stresses and strains on individuals, on the workers in the workplace. How do we balance those three? And I think we're beginning to see a range of ethical concerns raise their heads right now in ways that perhaps we didn't before. And new digital technologies are both driving that change, but they're also part of the solution to that change. How we can measure the stress using wearable digital technologies so that we can intervene more easily. But maybe it's the digital technology that's creating that stress in the first place. So we're in this interesting push and pull. We're being pushed by the digital technologies to move in this way, but they're also helping us to understand what's happening about physical stresses and mental stresses and how we can intervene and support people to take a break, to think about stress in the workplace in new ways so that they can interact and support their lifestyle and personalize how they enjoy working in a different way. So we've got some really interesting things, and as we start to get into more use of data and artificial intelligence in AI and machine learning, we're seeing more pressures around that. How is that data used? How are algorithms being used? How are decisions being made? How are we involved in those decisions? What happens when those decisions are being made by automated techniques that perhaps have evolved to such a scale that they're not even explainable anymore? We're in very interesting waters right now. We're driven by the technology and we're constrained by the technology. So that leads us to the fourth of these big dilemmas, which is the leadership dilemma. As we do that, our organizations are becoming more and more stressed and strained. How we organize, how decisions are made, and in particular, the role of leaders. As you know, that this is a theme of particularly the management science for many years. What's being talked about now by people like Julian Birkinshaw and Gary Hamel and a whole bunch of really interesting writers and authors and thinkers in this space is perhaps we have to think differently about leadership. And we have to think not just about bureaucracy and even meritocracy, where those with the best ideas are those that are in charge, but actually we're looking at how we organize around the opportunity. It's all about moving quickly, organizing to not just to be able to think about ideas from an experimentation point of view, learn fast, fail fast. But once we've learned, we have to scale quickly, find the opportunity, work quickly, move and operate in a way that optimizes our ability to create value, but does it without making huge impact on our workforce, the unpredictability of that in the workforce, the stresses and strains on our workplace. And also means that we're not just creating waste, we're not creating all sorts of exhaust kind of problems into society itself, not just with the physical idea, but also the idea of data, the idea of starting to collect more and more data that's leaving behind a kind of data debt. All of that information that's now being picked up by third parties and used in perhaps exploitative ways, in ways that we are not comfortable with. So we've got this interesting idea now of how do we move from bureaucracy to meritocracy to these sorts of adhocracy or holocracy kind of approaches. What does that mean for leadership? And in particular, one of the key things that I find the dilemma that most leaders are facing right now is, can they use data not just to look in the rearview mirror to say, here's what happened last quarter, here's what happened last week, therefore let's plan for this week, but to be able to say, in a world where what's happening in the future may not look like what happened in the past, how do we plan and lead? It's not simply by using some sort of algorithm that said, if this happened in the past, here's what will happen in the future with a little twist. It might say, that's interesting, but the future may not look like what just happened, particularly in a post-COVID world, in a world that's being stressed very much by the current economic crisis. Maybe what we're doing next isn't going to look like what we did. How does that work? How do we use information in ethical, meaningful ways to lead in an appropriate way in an environment where there's a lot of unpredictability? Some interesting techniques right now using digital technology to sense what's going on, but we're still in the early stages of that. So the leadership dilemma is, how do we use that data so that we can move forward in effective ways and change our behaviors as leaders? So the final and fifth dilemma really is about going back to, in the end, we know our organizations, we know our workplace, we know our way of working in society is about people. The human dilemma is, how do we ensure that this kind of automation does not dehumanize, does not desensitize us to what makes us human, what makes us work as individuals, or what makes us interact as individuals, but uses this technology in meaningful ways to accelerate those things that can, but also to support us as humans in those where that matters. So for me, one of the key areas here is building healthy digital innovation habits. Thinking about what we're doing in the workplace, not simply as, oh, we could automate that task so you don't have to do it, but thinking about us as individuals in the workplace working together, supported through these technologies and enhanced through the use of these digital technologies, and recognizing when we're stressed, when we're overworked, when these digital technologies are getting in the way, when they're removing some of what makes us human decision making, our instincts, our ability to interact informally. So we've got really interesting challenges right now to use digital technologies in positive ways, to support what we do and to help us as individuals and as humans to be more effective. That's the final dilemma for me, that perhaps is going to subsume all of the others in the coming months and years. How do we keep using digital technologies in human ways? So these are my five areas. This is the summary for me of 5 really interesting critical conversations that I get engaged in all the time, when I'm talking with individuals, when I'm talking with researchers, and when I'm talking with those in industry. I'm fascinated to hear if this resonates with you and your conversations, and to hear your stories. And a lot of what we're going to hear in the coming Tommy Flowers Network conference coming up on the 4th and 5th in May is about trying to raise some of these ideas. On the first day, we'll be talking about how does research in these digital technology, digital transformation areas, how does that change when we're trying to adapt to these kinds of interesting concepts of the dilemmas we face, doing research, being effective in a world that's changing quickly, that's changing the idea of interesting things like value, like trust, like how we see risk. Can we research effectively? What does research mean? How is research moving forward? And then the second day on the 5th of May is a lot about the industry response to that. How are industries using that research? How are they looking at the challenges? What do they see as the research challenges, and the ways in which they can work with researchers to drive that forward in an ethical way, in a meaningful way, in a way that's going to support some of the big areas that we think will be important for the future. So please join us. We'd love to see you there. There's some great speakers, and I think you'll enjoy the conversation and the follow-on activities from that event. So that's my opening salvo, just to get you going, just to get you thinking about digital transformation and the challenges. And let's see if we've got some comments and questions, and see what you think. Thank you. Anybody got any comments or questions?
Hi, Alan. It's Carol Fletcher. I can see that we've got Gabenja Salami, who's raised their hand.
Go for it.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me clearly, first of all?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for the presentation. I think that got me thinking there. I think my question is more, as humans, we're very poor at anticipating problems caused by digital transformation. Just to give an example, things like moving things to the cloud, crypto mining, they are creating other problems. So it's more pushing problems. So how do we get better as humans at anticipating some of these problems and planning for them?
I think it's a great question. And as you know, there are sort of always two kinds to this. There's the anticipated and the unanticipated issues that we have to face. I think a lot of it, what we have to do is try to be more explicit, opening up these conversations around themes like these 5 themes to say, when we're starting to make these changes, what are the broader implications for society? What are the implications for individuals and humans? What are the implications for the organizations? How does it change my perception of the world? And as I say, raising some of these key themes like, where's the value, who gets the value, how is value captured and shared? What do we think are the risks that are being created? How are those risks being traded off? What's the difference, for example, between operational risk, when we ship it, it has to work, versus delivery risk, it needs to be done now? How do we begin to see words like sustainability? What does that mean? Unpacking that, it's not just about reducing carbon emissions. There's a much broader sense in which we need to think about sustainability from all aspects. So I think for me, it's beginning to raise some of those ideas, opening that debate and creating meaningful frameworks where we can begin to trade off some of these ideas. And to me, that's the way that we move forward in this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Any more questions?
Hi, Alan, it's Carol again. I see some coming through in the chat. So I can see one from Natalie, which is, do you have further resources on where we can read more in depth about the 5 dilemmas, please?
Yeah, yes, indeed. These 5 dilemmas, there's no magic about this 5. It's the conversations that I've responded to in the last few months, when I've sort of sat back and said, what are the big things that I'm beginning to learn? And one of the things I started to do was to write some of these things down, including these 5 dilemmas and some other thoughts around these. And I publish some ideas each week around this through blog posts to alanwbrown.com. If you go to alanwbrown.com, you'll see some weekly dispatches. We also pick up these themes very clearly in the Digit Lab work. That research center is very focused on these ideas. So go to digit.ac.uk and you'll see quite a lot of information, quite a lot of publications, ideas that our community is beginning to surface around those 5 themes and more. And we'd love you to engage in that.
Lovely, thanks, Alan. And I can see another question here from Steve, which is, what risks do you see arising from creating digital chains connecting production to outcome versus separating or insulating these stages through more transactional interfaces that we have now? So, for example, he says errors, means of resolving disputes, cyber, etc.
Yes, part of the challenge, I think, when you tighten up this idea of outcome is you see some interesting changes of behavior. And in particular, one of the things I highlighted briefly was this idea of aligning incentives. So for example, if I go to, hypothetically, if I went to my university vice chancellor and I said, I'd like to move education from paying for the transaction, meaning I want to do an MBA. Here's £25,000. I want to sign up for the MBA. If we have to switch and say, actually, the MBA is free, but what happens is the outcome that you achieve, the value that's created as a result of you participating in that, we want to monitor. And when you see value, we want to see that distributed. One side of you says that's ideal, because then all sides are incented to make that valuable to you as a participant in the MBA. You'll become a better person, get a better job, think differently, ask better questions, become more confident. And that's what we all want. And we will receive some benefit from that as those that are delivering that MBA, and you'll receive the benefit. The problem is, how would you define and measure that? How would you understand what that outcome means? How would you change an institution like a university to be able to be funded and supported in a model where revenue recognition is delayed in that way and is subjective depending on the outcome? How would that work? Well, in education, that might be very difficult to see, but it's happening in other areas. It's happening in areas like the way in which, the classic Rolls-Royce example, power by the hour or thrust, being measured as you don't buy the aircraft engine, you buy some level of quality of service. We want this to fly for this many hours at this level of quality with this uptime and this response. And then you pay for that service, and it's up to, in this case, Rolls-Royce, to ensure it provides that to you and instruments the engine so that it understands what's going on, repairs it, does some sort of preemptive checks, all of those things, so you get the service you deliver. You can see how that could work in that world, and it is working. I think how that translates into many other worlds still has to be done. And I think there's going to be many barriers to overcome for that to be able to become the definitive way of working in many industries. But I think we can see some opportunities there that I think we should explore. Any more questions?
Can't see any more coming in the chat. I can't see if anyone's raised a hand. Are there any more questions for Alan?
Last chance for questions.
I think you've given us all so much to think about, Alan. We're going to all think of our questions afterwards and be emailing you probably.
You're welcome to do that. You can email me at a.w.brown@exeter.ac.uk.
Lovely. So if there aren't any more questions, I'm going to say a huge thank you, Alan, once again for joining us for that fascinating presentation. And as Alan said, we're going to be exploring more of these topics in the next Tommy Flowers Network Conference, which is in early May. And we'll put the link in the chat and get that out to everybody so you can register to join. It's a virtual conference and free to attend. So thank you all very much for listening and for your questions. And thanks again to Alan.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.